Jonah. There's a tendency to dismiss this as a kid's story. It's for flannel glass and plush animals. It's the kind of category that Beauty and the Beast or Toy Story or something like that fit into. But I wonder if there aren't types of truths that only these kind of stories can tell us. Remember when you were a kid and everything was possible. You could never be cooler than you were at 5 years old. But think back. Remember before the time you knew what was cool or trendy. Remember before the time you knew that Santa Claus wasn't really feasible given the global population of the world, the circumference of the planet, and the diameter of your chimney. Remember when the world was nothing but a ball of possibilities. And all you needed was a headband and a Walkman to march yourself fearlessly into the future. But what happens? When we grow up and we learn that everything is not possible. You can't be a tap-dancing astronaut architect no matter how much you want to be. And so slowly, over time, we begin to believe that tomorrow is just another today, that the world isn't remarkable. Walter Brueggemann has done some amazing work in helping us understand the role of the prophetic voice in the Old Testament. And he writes that the key pathology of our time is the reduction of imagination, so that we have become too numbed, sated, and co-opted to do serious imaginative work. In his book, The Prophetic Imagination, he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the prophetic must be imaginative because it calls us to what is not, or perhaps to what could be. He says this is why stories like Jonah and his whale are commonplace. They are meant to wake us up from what is. And so we find these kinds of stories all throughout ancient cultures. Stories that are clearly outside the norm of what is possible or what is expected from life, because that's precisely the point of the story. They are meant to help us imagine something that hasn't happened. And I would argue that the book of Jonah is uniquely positioned in that context. For me, it is about so much more than a specific person in a specific time, in a specific place. This is a story about what it means to be human. Just look at the way the story starts. We're not given any background on Jonah. We're not told where he's from. We're not even told when he's from. In fact, the first line of the story is this: "And the word of the Lord came to Jonah." It starts with an and. And presumes something, doesn't it? It presumes that the story has already started, but it leaves you to fill in the background. It's almost like the author wants Jonah to be a blank slate for us. Almost like the author has deliberately removed any details that might let you and I off the hook. That we would say it doesn't have anything to do with you. Maybe you could say it this way: Jonah was a student studying one day, and the word of the Lord came to him. Or Jonah was a salesperson working with a client one day, and the word of the Lord came to him. Jonah was a teacher, an electrician, a philanthropist, an artist, an unemployed actor, and the word of the Lord came to him. And the Lord said, "Go to the great city Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for the port, and after paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So, from the moment "and," the author has made this story as broad as you and I can imagine. And then we're immediately introduced to two cities, two locations, Tarshish and Nineveh, and Jonah heads for Tarshish, so let's start there. Some people think that Tarshish was either in what is today southern Spain, possibly in northern Africa near Carthage. We don't really know. But the interesting thing is that this city is that we know very little about it in terms of archaeology, and yet we have a significant number of literary references to this city. In 1 Kings, the fleets of Solomon sail to Tarshish to gather gold, silver, ivory, monkey, and peacocks. Obviously, monkey and peacocks, just as popular then as they are now. In Isaiah, the term ships of Tarshish is used not as a reference to any specific city, but instead it's used to describe very large, decadent, well-appointed boats. All of this has led some scholars to wonder about whether Tarshish was ever really a physical place to begin with. It seems like it's something more like paradise. Now, Tarshish may have and probably was at some point a real physical place. But over time, it became used in literature more as something like a far, far away place of great comfort. Think of it like Hawaii or Cancun, or if you remember all the way back to the glory days of Tom Cruise, you could think of it like the Kokomo. I'm not going to sing it. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, and he asked him to travel to Nineveh, but instead he left on a trip to Hawaii. And that's interesting. Because why did Jonah go to Tarshish in the first place? Well, according to the story, it was to flee from the Lord. So if you were going to run away from God, where might you try to go? Would you board a plane and go to the most beautiful place on the planet? If you wanted to avoid God, would you flee to the mountains to walk in the undisturbed beauty of nature? Would you leave for vacation? Well, maybe we're not completely in sync with Hebrew humor here, but I think we're supposed to be struck by the absurdity of Jonah running away to paradise to try to avoid God. But then again, there's something deeply profound here, isn't there? Because if you and I, if we really want to avoid God, we may not go off running to paradise, but if you're anything like me and you want to avoid God, you probably head for the spaces where you don't have to think about much. A vacation, a movie, a video game, out for some wings and a beer, maybe a fish taco, because I love fish tacos. But we go to what keeps us occupied, what keeps us amused. That word amused comes from Latin, and the root of the word is muse, which means to think or to reflect. We muse about something, we meditate on something, and A is just the negative prefix. We go to what amuses us because it stops us from thinking or reflecting or meditating or remembering. If I wanted to run away from God, I would go to where I don't have to think about Him anymore. And when you don't want to hear from God, where do you go? So that moment where you know that you have probably pushed the limit, you've had more to drink than you should. Or that moment that you think to yourself, I probably could do something in some small way about this world, the AIDS pandemic in Africa. I could get involved if I wanted to. Maybe that moment where you know that you just want to say something to humiliate somebody, and the truth is they deserve it and it would feel great, but that's not really the kind of person that you want to be, and you know it, and somewhere deep inside of yourself you know that you are supposed to go one way, but you don't want to, and you go the other. You just don't think about it. That's what Tarshish is. It's the place that you go to let yourself off the hook, and intentional distractions from the things that we know we should do and the person we know that we should be. And that brings up another interesting idea. Because if Tarshish is the place that we go to get away from God, then where is the place that we should go to connect with God? The author of Jonah describes Nineveh as this place of wickedness. He says its stench has come up before the Lord. And Jonah, the fool who runs to paradise to avoid God, knows something deeply profound here, doesn't he? That the spaces where God sometimes seems the least likely to be are exactly the places that we should expect to find him. Have you ever sat with someone who is grieving? Have you ever just loved someone when they lost someone they loved? Or they lost a job, or they've gone through a significant breakup or a relationship, and you just sat there and you experienced that pain with them. And you weren't sure how or why, but you knew in that moment it was important to be there. Have you ever just served somebody Maybe somebody less fortunate than you or I, maybe you traveled to another part of the world to help, and you knew that God was present in that space, in that place, in a way that you couldn't describe. Have you ever found yourself at the end of your rope? There's this thing that you're struggling with, this thing that somehow you want to change about yourself, but you just can't, and you are completely spiritually exhausted and bankrupt and poor. And all of a sudden you find yourself strangely blessed to be loved in the midst of it. Jonah seems to know that if he wants to avoid God, he needs to avoid the spaces and the places where people need God the most. Perhaps we could say it this way: that God is most present in the darkest, most despairing, most difficult moments of our journey. And this is one of the most fascinating points in the Jonah story, that God doesn't ask Jonah to bring him anywhere. He simply tells Jonah to go to Nineveh and name him, to celebrate God, to search God out in the spaces where we least expect to find him. Are there spaces in your life where you don't expect to find God? Maybe it's something personal. I don't expect to find God in my addiction to pornography. Maybe it's a physical space. I don't expect to see God in my workplace. Maybe it's a relationship. This marriage is so broken, I can't imagine how God would show up here. Where is it you can't imagine finding God? Because maybe that's where God is waiting for you. Eugene Peterson, in his book, Under the Unpredictable Plant, writes this. He says, "It is a discipline to destroy our illusions." That's what Tarshish is. It's the place that we go because we can't replace or replicate the experience of being a human before God. We think it can, but it can't. Because Tarshish is the thing that you think that you want. It is the greener grass that's always on the other side of the fence, but it's an illusion. And God is not interested in looking for a better place to be. He is interested in believing we can transform where we are. That means all of the spaces where you have a hard time imagining God ever showing up are the spaces where God is already there waiting for you.